In the decadent world of ancient Rome, power was both a privilege and a curse. The emperor, supreme in his authority, wielded his position with a mix of awe-inspiring grandeur and chilling ruthlessness. Among these rulers, Nero stands out, not only for his notorious cruelty, but also for his insatiable desire to shape the world according to his whims. His reign, beginning in 54 CE, was marked by extravagant excess, artistic obsession, and the dark shadow of personal indulgence that often left those around him at the mercy of his capricious will. Within this tempest of power and obsession, a singular story emerges, one that is both horrifying and tragic. The story of Sporus, a young boy enslaved and ultimately forced into a life no child could ever consent to, serving as both a victim and a tool for Nero's disturbing desires. Sporus was a slave child whose origins are shrouded in uncertainty, though some accounts suggest he may have been a beautiful boy captured during one of Rome's many military campaigns or acquired through the intricate networks of the city's vast slave trade. What is known, however, is that his life changed irrevocably when he caught the attention of Emperor Nero. It was Nero's fascination with Sporus' appearance and potential malleability that sealed the boy's fate. In the eyes of the emperor, Sporus was not merely a servant or a companion. He was an object of obsession, a living canvas upon which Nero could project his desires and fantasies. The innocence of childhood was brutally stripped away, replaced by a life defined by the emperor's whims, and the expectations of a society in which slaves were commodities to be bought, sold, and manipulated. The turning point in Sporus' life came when he was forced into a role that was both psychologically and physically devastating. Historical sources recount that Nero, having recently suffered the death of his young wife, Poppaea Sabina, desired to recreate her presence in his life, not through memory or mourning, but through a living substitute. In Sporus, Nero saw a way to fill that void, and the young boy was subjected to a series of transformations that would forever alter his identity. The most extreme of these was the ritualistic act of castration, an unspeakable violation that rendered Sporus unable to escape the role imposed upon him. This act was not only a statement of Nero's dominion, but also a cruel assertion of control over the body and soul of a child. By reshaping Sporus into the likeness of his deceased wife, Nero attempted to manipulate reality itself, blurring the lines between desire, grief, and domination in a manner both grotesque and tragic. Once transformed, Sporus was thrust into the life of an imperial consort, a position that placed him in close proximity to Nero's intimate world, yet removed from any semblance of autonomy. He was adorned in the attire of a Roman empress, instructed in the customs and rituals expected of a woman in the highest social station, and compelled to participate in ceremonies that solidified his role as a living replica of Poppaea. The psychological toll of such a transformation must have been immense. A child, forcibly stripped of his identity and subjected to the performative expectations of an adult world, was now tasked with fulfilling the fantasies of a capricious emperor. Every gesture, every word, every appearance was governed by the imperial gaze, leaving no room for personal freedom or self-expression. The relationship between Nero and Sporus, if it can be called that, was complex and deeply troubling. While some sources suggest a semblance of affection or attachment, it is critical to recognize that any such sentiment existed within a framework defined entirely by coercion. Sporus's consent was impossible. His position was dictated by force, fear, and survival. To modern eyes, this dynamic is profoundly disturbing, an intersection of sexual exploitation, psychological manipulation, and the absolute power wielded by an emperor who viewed human beings as malleable extensions of his will. The very idea that a child could be molded into the likeness of a lost spouse underscores the extremes of Nero's tyranny, reflecting a society in which absolute authority allowed for the most intimate violations to occur without legal or moral restraint. Sporus's existence in the imperial court was marked by both visibility and invisibility. He was seen as a figure of fascination, a living symbol of the emperor's control, yet his personal experiences, thoughts, and feelings were rendered almost entirely invisible. Roman historians, writing decades later, often focused on the sensational aspects of the story, the grotesque spectacle of castration, the emperor's obsession, the theatricality of Sporus's appearances, while giving little attention to the inner life of the boy himself. Yet it is in imagining Sporus's perspective that the true horror of his story emerges. Each day would have been a navigation of fear, performance, and enforced loyalty, with survival contingent upon the relentless management of an unpredictable and often cruel master. The gap between public perception and private suffering was vast, and it is precisely this dissonance that makes Sporus's story so haunting, a chilling reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and desire. Once transformed and installed in the imperial court, Sporus's life became a daily exercise in survival under constant scrutiny. The young boy, now forced to inhabit the role of an empress, had no private sphere, no sanctuary from the endless observation of attendants, courtiers, and above all, Nero himself. Every movement, every word, every expression was measured against the emperor's desires, a cruel performance in which failure was not merely embarrassing, it could be fatal. To navigate this world required a mastery of silent obedience, a profound adaptability, and a suppression of any instinct for self-preservation that might conflict with the whims of a tyrant. Childhood, with its curiosity, play, and freedom, was obliterated, replaced by a rigorous, almost ritualistic existence designed to satisfy the complex and often contradictory demands of an emperor who saw Sporus as both substitute and object. The court itself was a stage where Sporus's appearance and comportment were under relentless examination. He was adorned in garments befitting the highest status, taught to speak and move with the grace expected of a Roman empress, and constantly reminded of his role as a living memorial to Poppaea Sabina. This presentation extended beyond ceremonial events. In private moments, Sporus's body and identity were similarly subjected to Nero's obsession. Historians recount episodes in which the emperor paraded him before guests, demanded intimate attention, and treated the boy as a companion with all the privileges and responsibilities of a spouse. Yet beneath the surface, there existed a stark imbalance. Sporus had no agency, no ability to consent, and no recourse against a system that treated him as simultaneously human and object. The psychological strain of living in such a liminal space, neither fully child nor fully adult, neither fully self nor fully constructed persona, must have been profound, creating a life dominated by anxiety, fear, and coerced adaptation. Within this gilded prison, the social dynamics of the court added another layer of complexity. Slaves, freedmen, and courtiers each navigated a web of hierarchies and influence, aware that proximity to the emperor offered both opportunity and peril. For Sporus, relationships were inherently precarious. Genuine companionship was nearly impossible. Trust carried lethal risk, as anyone perceived to interfere with the emperor's desires could be punished severely. In this environment, every smile, every gesture, and every word required careful calculation. Sporus' survival depended not only on fulfilling the performative expectations imposed by Nero, but also on an acute awareness of the political undercurrents swirling around him. In essence, the young boy's life was one of constant negotiation, a tightrope walk in which a single misstep could have devastating consequences. The psychological consequences of such an existence are difficult to fully comprehend. Scholars have speculated that Sporus, like many individuals subjected to extreme coercion and identity manipulation, may have experienced a form of dissociation, a mental strategy to separate his sense of self from the roles forced upon him. To endure daily life as a child compelled into an adult and sexualized identity likely required a partitioning of identity, a survival mechanism that allowed him to continue functioning in a world where his autonomy had been systematically stripped away. This internal fragmentation, while adaptive in the short term, undoubtedly carried long-term emotional and psychological costs, leaving a legacy of trauma that historical accounts can only hint at. Nero's obsession with Sporus also extended into public display, intertwining performance, control, and personal fantasy. Some accounts describe the emperor conducting mock weddings, treating Sporus as both bride and consort, complete with formal ceremonies and elaborate banquets. Guests witnessed a scene of theatricality that blurred lines between mourning, desire, and power, yet the true cost, the exploitation and suffering of a young boy, was invisible to most. To contemporary historians, such spectacles reveal the extreme nature of imperial authority, the extent to which one man's whims could dictate another's entire existence, and the chilling capacity of power to erase personal boundaries. The court, in these instances, became a mirror reflecting the darkest intersections of political might, personal grief, and sexualized obsession. Despite the oppressive nature of this life, Sporus's presence in the court was not without influence. His very existence as a living simulacrum of Poppaea Sabina allowed Nero to exert a form of social and emotional manipulation over those around him. By displaying Sporus in ceremonial or intimate contexts, Nero reinforced his own narrative of control and dominance, demonstrating to courtiers and visitors alike that even grief, beauty, and human life could be shaped according to his will. In this way, Sporus's coerced role extended beyond personal suffering, becoming a tool of imperial propaganda, a reminder of the reach and arbitrariness of Nero's authority. The young boy's body and identity were weaponized, transformed into instruments that served both private obsession and public spectacle. Even within the confines of such absolute control, the traces of Sporus's humanity likely persisted. Historical accounts, though sparse, hint at a figure navigating immense adversity with endurance and adaptability. Though powerless to resist the overarching structure imposed upon him, survival necessitated acute observation, emotional regulation, and a form of inner resilience. The ability to continue living under conditions of extreme violation and manipulation speaks to both the cruelty of Nero's reign and the endurance of the human spirit under unimaginable oppression. Sporus, in this light, is emblematic of the countless voiceless victims of history whose lives were shaped and shattered by forces far beyond their control. The tragic trajectory of Sporus's life continued beyond the immediate sphere of Nero's obsession, extending into the perilous and unpredictable world of Roman politics. The court of Nero, though infamous for its cruelty and excess, was not isolated from the broader turbulence of the empire. Intrigue, conspiracies, and the constant threat of political upheaval were ever present, and those closely associated with the emperor, especially those whose existence symbolized his personal whims, were particularly vulnerable. Sporus' role as a living proxy of Poppaea Sabina placed him squarely at the intersection of personal desire and public power, rendering him both highly visible and extraordinarily fragile. The boy, or rather the young man he became, was continuously subject to the shifting tides of fortune that governed the lives of all who dwelled in the orbit of imperial authority. Nero's eventual demise in 68 CE, following a period of political chaos and widespread dissatisfaction with his rule, marked a profound turning point. With the emperor's suicide, the protective yet oppressive shield surrounding Sporus vanished, leaving him exposed in a world where survival was uncertain. Accounts suggest that Sporus did not escape the scrutiny of subsequent emperors and political factions. In particular, he became entwined with Nerva, one of Nero's successors, who may have regarded the young man as both a curiosity and a symbol of the excesses of the previous reign. During this period, Sporus's status shifted once more. No longer merely an intimate of the emperor, he became a figure whose survival depended on his ability to navigate the treacherous social and political dynamics of a court that had little tolerance for vulnerability. In essence, Sporus's coerced identity, initially shaped by Nero's personal obsessions, became a lifelong burden, a reminder of the ways in which childhood trauma could reverberate across an entire lifetime. One of the most striking aspects of Sporus's later life was his continued objectification and manipulation. Historical sources recount that he was forced into marriages, sometimes to men of high status, in an effort to consolidate political alliances or to satisfy the desires of rulers who viewed him as a tool rather than a person. Each union was less a matter of personal connection and more a manifestation of the complex interplay between power, spectacle, and social expectation. In these arrangements, Sporus's autonomy remained non-existent. He could neither consent nor resist, and the psychological consequences of repeated coercion were likely profound. The young man's identity, already fractured by castration and forced emulation of another, was continuously reshaped to meet the needs and whims of those in power, reinforcing a cycle of exploitation and erasure that began in his earliest years under Nero. The psychological implications of such a life are nearly impossible to overstate. Sporus, having endured the transformation from child to consort under circumstances of extreme duress, was subjected to a prolonged and persistent assault on his sense of self. Each new ruler, each ceremonial appearance, each forced marriage contributed to a life in which personal agency was systematically denied. Survivors of similar historical circumstances often experience profound trauma, including dissociation, chronic anxiety, and a persistent struggle to distinguish self from imposed identity. While direct evidence of Sporus's internal state is scarce, Roman historians tended to focus on scandal, spectacle, and morality rather than personal suffering. It is reasonable to infer that the long-term psychological cost was immense. His life serves as a stark illustration of the human consequences of absolute power wielded without restraint. Despite the ongoing victimization, Sporus's story is also a testament to resilience. He survived in a world that frequently sought to erase or repurpose him, navigating a landscape dominated by adult authority, societal expectation, and political intrigue. The endurance required to maintain any semblance of survival, physically, emotionally, and socially, demonstrates an adaptability forged under extreme duress. Yet even this resilience was bound by limits. Sporus, fate, remained tethered to the desires and agendas of others, a reality that underscored the precariousness of life within the inner circles of Roman power. His very existence continued to provoke fascination and horror, reflecting both the cruelty of human ambition and the capacity of individuals to endure even the most harrowing circumstances. Sporus's life ultimately reflects the intersection of personal tragedy and historical spectacle. He was a figure caught between the private desires of a tyrannical emperor and the public expectations of Roman society, subjected to both intimate violation and social manipulation. The castration that initiated his transformation was not an isolated act, but the beginning of a lifelong pattern in which his body, identity, and autonomy were systematically controlled. His experience highlights the vulnerabilities inherent in a society that permitted such extremes of power to operate unchecked, where a child could be reduced to an instrument of desire and political strategy, and where survival often required subordination of every personal impulse. In contemplating Sporus's story, modern readers are confronted with profound ethical and emotional questions. How does one reconcile the aesthetic and cultural achievements of a civilization with the personal suffering inflicted upon its most vulnerable members? How does history remember those who lived not as agents of their own destiny, but as instruments of another's obsession? Sporus, in his coerced emulation of Poppaea Sabina, his forced marriages, and his navigation of perilous courts, embodies these tensions. He is at once a victim, a spectacle, and a figure whose endurance illuminates the human capacity to persist even when stripped of autonomy and identity. Through the lens of his life, the darker currents of Roman power, its capacity for cruelty, obsession, and manipulation, come into stark relief, leaving an indelible imprint on the historical imagination. As the years passed, Sporus continued to navigate a world that had never allowed him the freedom of choice or the comfort of safety. While some records hint that he may have survived into the later Flavian dynasty, the details of his final years remain shrouded in uncertainty. What is certain, however, is that the shadow of Nero's obsession lingered over his entire life. The transformation imposed upon him in childhood, the forced mimicry of Poppaea Sabina, and the continual political manipulation he endured all contributed to a lifetime defined not by his own desires, but by the whims of those in power. In this sense, Sporus' life was emblematic of the countless individuals throughout history whose fates were dictated by forces beyond their control, serving as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the endurance of the human spirit under extreme oppression. Some sources suggest that Sporus' role as a substitute wife continued long after Nero's death, reflecting the persistence of social and cultural structures that permitted the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. It is said that he may have been married to a freedman or an influential figure, serving again as a symbol rather than as a partner in any meaningful sense. These unions, likely arranged for political convenience or as a continuation of the spectacle that defined his earlier life, highlight the cruel reality that even the passage of time did not afford him autonomy. His identity, once forcibly altered, remained constrained by the expectations and obsessions of others, demonstrating how deeply formative early trauma can shape, and in many ways define, a person's trajectory. The historical record, however fragmented and biased, also leaves room for reflection on Sporus as a figure of remarkable endurance. To survive the initial violence inflicted by Nero, the psychological demands of performing as a surrogate for a deceased empress, and the ongoing manipulation of subsequent rulers required not only adaptability, but also an extraordinary degree of resilience. Each day was a negotiation between visibility and invisibility, performance and survival, coercion and the faintest traces of agency. Though Sporus's personal feelings and inner life are largely inaccessible to modern historians, the very fact of his survival suggests a capacity to endure circumstances that would have destroyed most others. In this light, he emerges not merely as a victim, but as a human being whose existence illuminates both the cruelty of power and the quiet persistence of life under oppression. The broader implications of Sporus's story extend beyond the personal. His life serves as a lens through which to examine the excesses and moral complexities of Roman imperial culture. The court of Nero, like many absolute systems of power, allowed for the conflation of personal desire, political necessity, and public spectacle in ways that could devastate the lives of individuals. Sporus was caught at the intersection of these forces. A child forced to become a woman, a slave compelled to embody the emperor's grief and desire, and a human being whose body and identity were repeatedly manipulated for purposes that were entirely external to his own welfare. The ethical and emotional dimensions of this reality resonate across time, prompting reflection on the responsibilities of power, the vulnerabilities of the powerless, and the enduring human consequences of coercion and exploitation. In examining Sporus's story, it is also important to recognize the ways in which history has rendered him simultaneously visible and invisible. Roman historians, such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, often focused on the sensational aspects of his life: the castration, the forced imitation of Poppaea, the emperor's obsession, while largely ignoring his personal suffering or inner perspective. This tendency highlights a broader historical pattern in which the experiences of marginalized individuals, particularly those who were enslaved or exploited, are subsumed beneath the narratives of the powerful. By seeking to reconstruct Sporus's story, modern readers and historians can honor his humanity and acknowledge the profound suffering imposed upon him, even when the sources themselves are incomplete or biased. Ultimately, Sporus's life exemplifies the devastating impact of absolute power on vulnerable individuals, particularly children. From the moment he was singled out by Nero to the years spent navigating subsequent political and social pressures, his existence was shaped by external control and coercion. Yet despite these horrors, the fact that he endured offers a testament to resilience in the face of extreme adversity. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human history, the ways in which beauty, youth, and vulnerability can be exploited, the intersections of grief and obsession, and the capacity of authority to impose unimaginable suffering on those who lack protection or status. Sporus's life, both tragic and illuminating, remains a haunting chapter in the history of Rome, a reminder that even in a world defined by spectacle and power, the human experience, its suffering, endurance, and complexity, cannot be entirely erased. In reflecting on Sporus's legacy, we are compelled to examine not only the horrors of his personal story, but also the broader patterns it reveals. His life illustrates the intersection of sexuality, power, and vulnerability, revealing the mechanisms by which authority can distort and dominate the most intimate aspects of human existence. It also serves as a call to remember the voices of those who, like Sporus, were denied the opportunity to speak or act freely. By acknowledging and exploring his experience, historians, scholars, and readers gain insight into the human cost of unchecked power, the moral ambiguities of history, and the enduring need to protect the vulnerable from the caprices of those who wield authority without restraint. Sporus's tragic journey from enslaved child to coerced consort and survivor of imperial obsession stands as both a historical lesson and a sobering reminder of the profound consequences of cruelty, desire, and exploitation. Sporus's story, while rooted firmly in the tumultuous and decadent world of ancient Rome, continues to resonate with modern audiences, because it encapsulates timeless themes of power, exploitation, and human vulnerability. Scholars and historians often revisit his life not merely as a sensational anecdote of Nero's cruelty, but as a profound case study in the effects of coercion and the erasure of personal agency. In contemporary discussions of trauma, identity, and the ethics of power, Sporus serves as a haunting reminder of what can happen when individuals, particularly children, are subjected to extreme control and manipulation. His existence forces a confrontation with the darker aspects of human desire and the ways in which authority can distort morality, empathy, and justice. From a psychological perspective, Sporus's experiences align with what modern clinicians would recognize as complex trauma. The forced castration, the imposition of a false identity, and the continuous pressure to perform within the confines of a courtly spectacle would have produced a lifetime of emotional and cognitive stress. Experts suggest that such experiences often result in dissociation, identity fragmentation, and long-term difficulties with self-perception and relational trust. While we cannot know the intimate details of Sporus's internal life, these inferences allow us to appreciate the magnitude of the suffering he endured and the extraordinary resilience required simply to survive. His story provides an ancient precedent for understanding the enduring psychological consequences of exploitation, coercion, and enforced identity transformation, issues that sadly remain relevant in modern contexts as well. Culturally, Sporus' life also illustrates the ways in which societies can normalize and even celebrate the subjugation of the vulnerable when power is concentrated in the hands of a few. The Roman court, with its elaborate ceremonies, public displays, and obsession with image, treated human beings as malleable instruments to achieve political, social, or personal ends. Sporus, once a child of unknown origin, became a living symbol of the emperor's grief, desire, and domination, his autonomy systematically stripped away for the benefit of spectacle and authority. This cultural dimension reminds us that exploitation is not merely a matter of individual cruelty, but is often embedded within broader social structures that permit, even encourage, such behavior. By studying his life, we gain insight into the interplay between personal pathology and societal norms, as well as the enduring ethical dilemmas surrounding power and vulnerability. In modern historical discourse, Sporus is frequently cited as an example of the human cost behind the grandeur and excess of imperial Rome. While emperors like Nero are remembered for their political acts, artistic ambitions, and notorious cruelty, the lived experiences of those under their power provide a more nuanced understanding of the era. Sporus. Life underscores that history is not solely shaped by the decisions of rulers, but also by the suffering and endurance of the powerless. In this sense, his story functions as both a historical lesson and a moral inquiry. It challenges us to recognize the humanity of those whose lives were dominated by forces they could not control, and to question the ethical frameworks that allowed such domination to flourish. Modern interpretations also explore the symbolic significance of Sporus's coerced transformation. By forcing a child to emulate a deceased spouse, Nero blurred the boundaries between grief, desire, and control, creating a living tableau that was both intimate and horrifying. Today, scholars analyze this act not merely as an example of sexual exploitation, but as a manifestation of the extremes of human obsession and the potential for authority to manipulate both identity and reality. In literature, art, and psychohistorical studies, Sporus emerges as a figure whose experiences illuminate broader truths about the human condition: the capacity for cruelty, the resilience of the oppressed, and the fragile nature of autonomy under coercive power. Finally, reflecting on Sporus's story invites a broader contemplation of memory, narrative, and historical justice. While the sources from antiquity often reduce him to a footnote in the saga of Nero's excesses, modern scholarship seeks to restore his presence as a fully realized human being. By acknowledging the trauma he endured and the resilience he displayed, we honor not only the historical record but also the ethical imperative to recognize the humanity of those whose voices have been silenced. His life, tragic yet enduring in its impact, reminds us that history is not only the story of the powerful, but also of those who survived despite them, bearing witness to both the horrors inflicted and the strength required to endure them. In conclusion, Sporus's journey from enslaved child to coerced imperial consort, and ultimately to a survivor navigating the treacherous aftermath of Nero's reign, offers a chilling yet profound lesson. His story embodies the intersections of power, obsession, vulnerability, and resilience, illustrating how human lives can be shaped, manipulated, and scarred by the ambitions of others. It is a narrative that transcends its historical moment, resonating across centuries as a cautionary tale of authority unchecked and the enduring capacity of the human spirit to endure unimaginable circumstances. By remembering Sporus, we do not merely recount the excesses of Nero, we confront the ethical, psychological, and cultural legacies of a life stolen and reshaped, finding in his survival both tragedy and a testament to human endurance.